Okay, I was. My name's David, and I wanted to upload this video. I don't. This might just bore you to death. This story, but I had a story I wanted to share, and about when I was growing up. I'm originally from Powell, Tennessee, and I grew up on a dead end road named Shady Lane, and my neighbor across the road was Butch. Taylor is what I want to think his last name was. I'm not sure on his last name, but what I wanted to share with you about is like growing up and just a little bit about Butch, my neighbor, and probably a lot of people that might listen to this may have a Butch living next door or around the neighborhood that they knew growing up. But when I was a kid, I used to go over. He lived in a two-story house, like with a basement, and the basement was kind of like the man cave. He was. I don't remember Butch. I don't remember seeing Butch ever without a beer in his hand, and he loved to drink Bush beer. And he was a Vietnam veteran. I want to say that he was in Vietnam from 1967 to 68 or 66 to 67. And I used to go over there. He loved to watch NFL football, and we used to watch Monday Night Football together. I go over there and just pass the time with him, and he didn't have a lot of friends. He kind of stayed to himself and stayed drunk most of the time. He was friends with my dad. My dad was a U.S. Marine, and Butch was a U.S. Marine and a combat veteran. And he used to come over and talk to my dad, Kenny, several times a week. Pass the time. And then there was a neighbor up the hill from him, Dick Bean, I think was his name, and he used to, hang out with Dick. They rode a lot. They both had Harley Davidsons. So anyway, what I remember about Butch, and I don't even know if he's still alive. It's been years and years since I. It's probably been 2005 or six since I seen him last. But there's Bush married a woman that had a couple of kids, a couple of daughters, I think. And one thing that I remember about Butch is that his daughter, his stepdaughter, had got married to a guy, and apparently the guy had beat the hell out of her. And she come home and she was trying to hide from Butch because she was scared of what Butch might do if he found out what had happened. But anyway, of course, Butch found out and could see the bruises on her face, and Butch grabbed a ball bat and left. And he went over to this guy's house and he broke his arms in two places, broke all of his ribs, broke his legs, and he gave a stern warning to the man that if he was to ever lay a hand on his daughter again, the next time he saw him, he would make it hurt. And the guy ended up. The story that I heard is the guy ended up spending 6 months in the hospital recovering from his injuries. He never filed charges against Butch, but that was the kind of person Butch was. And Butch told me some of his combat stories when he was in. I think he was in Da Nang. He was up where all the Marines fought near the parallel. I think near the border with North Vietnam mostly. And he told me one story about they were on patrol near the Cambodian border, and there was three guys in his unit that were almost done with their tour. Like I'm talking about less than a month. They were going home. And he told me about his lieutenant. And by the way, if Butch, if you watch this or anybody watch this, you don't like it, just have it deleted off of the internet. I would like to just sit down and talk with Butch sometime and let him tell his own story. But back to this story, he was telling me that his lieutenant instructed these three veterans that were almost done with their tour in Vietnam and ready to go home. He had them cross this creek or river into Cambodia alone with no support, like while everybody else stayed on the Vietnam side. And Butch told me they got into a contact, and they got into a firefight, and he said, we wanted to go over there and help these guys, and the lieutenant would not let any more of us go. Well, it ended up, the moral of the story is the three guys got killed by the Viet Cong or whoever they were over there. They were fighting. All three of them got killed. And Butch told me that he never forgive his lieutenant for doing that to these guys. You know, it wasn't right. And maybe the lieutenant just knew that they were ambushed there, and he didn't want to get the rest of his unit sucked in. I don't know if I wasn't there, and I don't know what happened. But Butch told me the next time they got into a firefight, he said he shot his lieutenant in the leg. And he said, I went up to him with a knife and put it to his throat and told him, if I ever see you again in this world, I'm going to kill you. And I can imagine the feelings of losing like some of your closest friends that may have even saved your life during your tour, and then having them sacrificed for nothing. And Bush told me they got him out of there and they never saw him again. The other thing he told me is when he would go into combat, they would always give him an M16. And he said as soon as they got into an engagement and they killed a few Viet Cong or whatever, he would always throw his M16 away and get an AK-47. He said the M16 would just jam and you're dead. If you're in a firefight and you got a jam weapon, you're dead. And he said, of course, as soon as they went back to base, they would always confiscate the AK-47 and give him another M16, and he hated it. But he was telling me one time they were on patrol somewhere, and they come across this dead Viet Cong who was face down in the mud, and he said he still had his AK-47 on his body. He said we rode his body over, and he said he looked like he'd been there for a week or two. He's kind of bloated. And he said, I pulled that AK-47 off of him. Bear in mind, it had been in the mud under a dead body that's decaying. And he said, he said the thing just shot off like nothing, like it was brand new. And he said that's the thing that I loved with the AK-47 was it was dependable. And he said with the M16, if you got just a little grit in that weapon, it would. He said you spent all your time cleaning the damn thing. You know, he said a little grit is jamming. Of course, now maybe they modified it. I heard that they changed the design. And if you really want to get a great capture of what went on in the Vietnam War, there's a book, and I forget the guy that wrote the book. But the name of the book is Blood on the Risers, and it really gives a good caption of what an infantryman went through from going to the Vietnam, fighting in a conventional way until this guy went into special ops and started doing more like there'd be only like 7 of them go out and they would have no contact and no support for like 2 weeks. But he said we were way more effective than the conventional army was over there. But back to another story with Butch's experience in Vietnam. He was telling me once when he got shot. He said they went into a little bitty village where there's only 2 or 3 hooches, and he said there was one hooch to the left of him, and he said he kind of made his way around the hooch, and it was an ambush. There was the Viet Cong had machine guns waiting on them. And he said they shot me and hit me in the leg, and he said I fell down, and he said luckily there was just a little berm of dirt that he was able to lay down. He said I was laying flat down, and he said I know they was trying to still shoot me because he said the bullets were kicking up the dirt on that little berm. So he said I couldn't get up and run because he said I knew if I moved I'm dead. He said and then he said they quit shooting. He said they're just sitting there, waiting for us to make a mistake, and we're dead. And he said my lieutenant come around the hooch and was hiding behind the hooch and told me, "Don't worry, Butch, we're going to get you. We're going to get you out of there." And he said I hollered at the lieutenant, "Do not come here. You're going to get killed. Don't come over here and try to get me." And he said as soon as they heard me talking, they started shooting again. And he said they couldn't hit me. as long as I laid flat on my ground. And anyway, he said that lieutenant finally couldn't control himself. So he said he come out there, exposed, and grabbed me by the collar and started trying to pull me back around behind the hooch. And he said when he did, they just lit him up. He said they just riddled the guy with bullets. And he said I kind of drug my body back over to where I had been. And he said they kept trying to shoot at me and couldn't get me. But he said that lieutenant laid there out in the open. He said they didn't finish him off. He said they left him alive, and they wanted to pull in more guys, and that was a tactic that was used. I've heard very often from Vietnam vets during that conflict. And I don't know. He laid there and he said that lieutenant was just moaning and groaning and drowning in his own blood. And he said it took him like 2.5, almost 3 hours before he finally died and finally, succumbed to his injuries. And, I don't know if they waited till dark. I mean, but finally, I guess it was all clear. And they threw some smoke grenades, but I can't remember the details of the story. It's been so long since he told me about it, but he said they were finally able to get him to safety and medevac him out, and he was able to survive and, return to the States. And I remember old Butch, like when I was in high school, I had a friend across the road, Dwayne Rader, and we grew up riding little motorcycles all over the woods and stuff. And one night, I don't know if we was having ice cream or something. We was sitting on the back porch, and I heard this hiss sound like a fuse. And all of a sudden, this little bottle rocket comes up right between my face and Dwayne's face and explodes. I mean, perfect, right between us. And I could hear laughter down in the darkness, like, boys, if y'all was in Vietnam, you'd be going home in body bags now. What was left of you? Yeah, that was Butch, our neighbor. And, he told me that this is the story that really freaked me out. So Butch had a photo album of his days in Vietnam. He had a photograph of this girl. I don't know if he was in Thailand or Taiwan. Had this sexy little prostitute and had this big white yellow snake wrapped around her neck. And then he had a picture of him standing with his M16 butt against his right leg and this Gook or Viet Cong or MVA. I'm not really sure what it was. But he had this guy leaned up. He was sitting on the ground, sitting up against Butch's leg, and he said, you see that guy? He said he'll never kill another U.S. Marine again. And he said I scalped that guy. He said I still have his scalp till today. And then he went into explaining. He said I cut his scalp off, and then he said I made a perfect square out of his scalp. And he said I laid it out and then he said I cut 2 little holes in the corners, kind of like. And then he said I laid it out in the sunlight and I let it dry, so it would lay flat. And then he said I got a leather, like a piece of leather you'd make a shoelace in a boot or something, a long leather shoelace. He said I made a necklace with that thing. And he said I wore it until I got shot, he said I thought or I believed, I was superstitious that somehow that would protect me from enemy fire, from enemy bullets, and keep me alive. And he said, I still got it. And I said, and he was kind of drunk. And I said, you're full of shit, but you ain't got it. He said, he didn't say nothing to me. I think I probably pissed him off just telling him he's full of shit. See, he went back in his bedroom and was rummaging around, and so help me God, he come in there with it. He still had it. He didn't have the leather strap, but he still had the scalp. Throwed it down in front of throwed it down in my lap, and there it was, man. There's no mistaking that it was somebody's scalp, and it's just I'm thinking, my God, what has this dude went through, man? I mean. I felt for the guy. He's, and I think he medicated a lot of his trauma and a lot of things that he whatever the best part of Butch, it was in Vietnam, and whatever come back was like a shadow of the man that he once had been, I think. And I think he just got good at his job, which was killing people. And when the first Gulf War came around in 1990 and 91, he went to the Marine Corps recruiting station and tried to re-enlist, but they wouldn't give him. They wouldn't put him back on active duty because he was too old. But he really wanted to go back to fight, you know. And that those were days when I was growing up, and a people that I remember, um, yeah, that I remember that kind of left an impression on my mind, man. And he had trouble adjusting back to civilian life. I know he got a job at the post office, but almost killed a couple of people there, so they let him go. Like he just couldn't control himself, or you would get the feeling that yeah he'll be cordial with you and talk to you, but he really don't want to have nothing to do with you. He likes to keep a distance from you. And don't I'm making a YouTube video, so there was that aspect of Butch, but I always I cut his grass. So he used to pay me to cut his yard, and we shot guns together in his backyard. He liked to have a few guns, and that's about enough about Butch. But I don't know if it's right for me to really speak about his experiences, but if I get a chance, I'm in the Philippines now, but if I ever get a chance to go back to Powell, and if he's still alive, and if he will sit down and talk with me, I'll try to let him share his own story. Um, but this is another thing about my own past. I'm a helicopter pilot by profession. Been flying helicopters for 21 years. And one story that one book I read by Robert Mason was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam in the First Air Cavalry. The name of the book is Chicken Hawk, and that man's experience, just it felt like it was unbelievable. It felt like it was a surreal experience. And he talked about going into LZs, and there would be a Viet Cong with an AK-47 who would take women and children and tie a rope around the women and children so they couldn't run away. And they would be standing there shooting at the helicopters as they approached. And for the door gunners to kill the shooter, they would have to kill 4 or 5 women and children to get to him. And of course, who wants to kill women and children? And they knew it was very hard for American soldiers to just, blast away at women and children. And they used them as a human shield. That's the kind of enemy that, they dealt with over there. And Robert Mason's book had a picture of a map in the front of it when I was reading it. And in 2006, I was so curious to go to these places. I booked a trip to Vietnam, and I went there for a month and toured Vietnam, and I honestly just followed the map and locations of Robert Mason's map in his book called Chicken Hawk. And when I would get to an area that was of significance in his story, it was amazing how many. Like I went to An Khê. And in An Khê was a place called the Golf Course, which is a very common place for the First Air Cavalry during the Vietnam conflict. And in the hotel, I met one of the owners who was a young man during the Vietnam War who knew exactly all of the locations that I was talking about. And, for example, Robert Mason told after he would haul the wounded, they would come back to An Khê and land the helicopters, like 4 or 5 of them, in the river. The river was very shallow. And then there would be Vietnamese there waiting to be paid. The pilots and the flight crews would just pay them cash in hand to wash the blood and the body organs and whatever the body fluids out of the choppers because it was just nasty. So they would take the river water and wash the choppers out. And so I went there, and the facility that was the golf course now is controlled by the Vietnamese military, and they don't even want you to come to the gate and take a picture. They don't like that. They won't let you go on base, so you can't really go around. The only places that you can go are places that's been abandoned or whatever. And the owner of the hotel at On K was telling me that even till today, his parents' house in the jungle, he said almost every day you can hear a pig will step on a landmine where we didn't carpet bomb, but I mean we did carpet bomb, but they would just drop landmines everywhere. And he says sometimes the mines, because they're 50 years old, they get the corrosion. Something happens that triggers them, and they'll go off. And he says you can hear it in the jungle almost every day, or a pig or something will step on one. And it was interesting to hear his experience as a Vietnamese who had worked there on the base, during the conflict. And then I went over to play coup, and then went to where another Vietnam friend of mine was in the Pink Panthers, and he said they were some of the pilots that first flew the Cobras in Vietnam. And anyway, Robert Mason's story was just he was talking about getting these American soldiers were up on top of a hill, and they they were surrounded by NVA or Viet Cong, and he said they were going on the chopper, and he said I was overloaded, but he said I knew if I leave one man behind, he's just dead. He's dead, right? And he said I made a decision. We are either all going to get out of here alive, or we're going to die here together. That was his decision. And he said the chopper was too heavy to get enough altitude to clear the jungle. But he said off to one side of this hill was kind of bamboo. So he said, what I think I'm going to do is try to push through the bamboo and start getting the airspeed down the hill and experience a thing called effective translational lift. So once you get your airspeed up, the aircraft will lift more than it would in a hover situation. So if you're not a chopper pilot, you won't really understand that part that well. But he said he was able to get some airspeed, and he said he totally destroyed the rotor blades. But he said they held together long enough to get them back to base, and they had to change them and replace them. But these things, these guys' experiences and how they lived through that and what they saw. I see a lot of veterans interviewed online, and they can share their story, but what they can't share is the smell. They can't share the sounds, and they share their experience, but it's very limited. The audience can hear it, but they'll never smell it. And I'm grateful, by God's grace, I've never had to be in combat, and I hope to God I never have to be ever anywhere on the planet. But my heart goes out to vets, and the thing is, this is the other thing. When I made my trip to Vietnam, if you go to the shores of Normandy and you go across Europe, there's all types of World War II monuments and recognition and acknowledgement of American soldiers who died there. For example, in Leyte in the Philippines, I've been there, where General Douglas MacArthur came ashore and to retake the Philippines. There's a massive monument there with MacArthur and his other commanders and aides and the president of the Philippines at the time. But when you go to Vietnam, there is no acknowledgement of all the American men who died there, who willingly went there. They set aside their personal goals and ambitions and careers and dreams and their personal love life and everything. They set aside their life to go and answer the call of their country at that time, what they, and they went there. But when you go to Vietnam, there you will not find one statue or one acknowledgement of all the men who died and suffered and lost their arms and lost their legs and lost their brothers in arms and lost their friends. And there's nothing there to give acknowledgement of what those boys did for our country, right? They didn't go there because they just felt like going somewhere randomly and killing a bunch of people. Maybe some of them did, but most of them didn't. They just wanted to serve their country. And the only place that I saw in Vietnam that gives a acknowledgement of the war is the American Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. But it's not the kind of museum that you and me would think would be an acknowledgement of the guys' sacrifices. It's really captured that it was the Americans' war. So it's almost like the Vietnamese remove it from themselves. The whole war wasn't their war. It was these Americans coming to our country unwelcome and uninvited and interfering with what they were having a civil war between the southern Vietnam and northern Vietnam. And kind of, it's kind of like a fight between two men, and then another guy comes in and just steps between them and starts, like he ain't got no, what are you doing, man, right? It's a fight between, it's right, what are you doing? It's not your place, right? But if you go to the museum, that is the impression that you got. And then on top of it, it's like they want to capture the atrocities of the American soldiers. Now, they don't capture the atrocities of the MVA. You won't see any photographs in that museum that capture the atrocities of the MVA or the Viet Cong or even the Southern Vietnamese, right? They did no wrong. It's just the image of what the America forces done there, and what they perceive was criminal or acts against humanity. And of course, they're going to say it like that. So my heart goes out to Vietnam veterans, and I find a lot of groups around America that are trying to give these men. I don't know how many Vietnam veterans I've heard tell me after their 1-year tour of Vietnam, when they come back to the United States, the very first thing they did when in the airport in L.A. or San Francisco is they went into the bathroom, they took off their uniform and threw it in the trash and put on civilian clothes. It was like the entire society was punishing them for presidential executive choices and decisions, And, my father was alive in that time, and he said they just would not allow our forces to win. And another friend of mine was in Vietnam. He was part of an artillery unit. And he said, David, I was in Vietnam for 2 weeks. And he said, I could tell you the way that we were fighting that battle, we weren't even there to win. He said, we would take some hill, and who knows how many of our men would bleed, die, and give their life for this hill. And then he said, we'd hang out there for a week or two, and then we'd just abandon it. And then he said 1 or 2 months later, we'd be right back there taking it again. I mean, it's a losing proposition the way that they were doing combat military operations there. I'm not even a soldier, but all you got to have is a little ounce of common sense that is not going to be the way you win a battle or a war. So my heart goes out to those guys that seem to be just faded away and just forgotten about. And Butch is a guy that Butch let me know what kind of sacrifices had taken place just for us to experience the freedoms and liberties that we have. And that what I find a lot of Americans take absolutely for granted, you don't see people pledging allegiance to the flag. I've never seen the president, he don't have no heart of patriotism. In fact, he don't even act like he has a soul. He looks like an empty shell. He's already dead. He's just not buried. And anyway, I just want to take a minute. If this content is worthless to you, or maybe it can put you to sleep, a lot of times I can't sleep. I'll hop on YouTube and watch some dude yapping around, and it's like a sedative. It just puts me to sleep. I'll be asleep in just minutes. Thanks. I hope you hit like, and I'm planning to make some more videos and keep sharing my experiences.